1948. Turned the ground into mud, followed by hurricane-force winds. In its wake lay miles of pine trees flattened by the storm. In April of 1939, sawmill equipment from both Walter Wieland's mill and the Blau mill was put on a flat car in Alto, Michigan, and shipped by train to Stowe, Massachusetts. The crew drove out by automobile and had to wait 3 or 4 days for the train to arrive before the work could begin. During the winter months following the storm, the United States government, under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, realized that it needed help in the cleanup of these downed trees. They broadcast by radio that sawmills were needed. Walter Wieland, who was vacationing in Florida at the time, heard one of these broadcasts, so he came home by way of Massachusetts. He was one of the sawmills given a job. Other mills came from Pennsylvania and Minnesota, but there were no sawmills from Massachusetts itself because the area had been lumbered out for years and no sawmill operations then existed. It was even difficult to buy simple lumbering items in the local Massachusetts hardware stores. The first crew included Walter Wieland, Lloyd Blau, Noah Blau, Bill Lott, Bernie Stahl, and Eugene Krause. The cooks were Elizabeth Wieland, Emma Blau, Catherine Cease, and Lorna Lott. A month later, Walter Wieland returned to Michigan to hire another crew so that the work could progress faster and be finished before too much insect damage was done to the logs. By late summer, you could actually hear bugs eating the logs and see the insect borings falling from them. The second crew hired included Irvin Blau, George Wieland, Harry Wills, Bill Clark, Wayne Farney, Bruce Farney, Keith Graham, Dee Yeiter, Walt Schaefer, and Barney Cudney. These Michiganders dubbed their campsite Michigan City. They nailed a crude sign, "Welcome to Michigan City," to nearby trees. The women slept in Walter Wieland's trailer. Most of the men slept in a large tent, and 4 others slept in their little house in the woods. They built their little house in the woods with lumber sides and a tar paper roof. In August, when the sawing was finished, they had to dismantle it, pull the nails out, and return the lumber to the U.S. government stacks. A well was drilled for their water supply, and a barrel was filled with water and put in the center of camp to be used in case of fire. The cooks, who also had the job of washing and ironing the men's very dirty and sweaty clothing, were happy to have a water source nearby instead of having to haul it from a distance. The cooking was done in a large tent. Meat, potatoes, gravy, baked beans, and pie were the usual dinner fare. Bread was purchased from a bakery peddler who came around a couple of times each week at the end of his route. He was happy to sell the bread that he had left very cheap. On Sundays, pancakes were mixed up in a huge dishpan and served to all. However, getting supplies to feed 16 hungry men was not an easy task. The local store did not even stock staples such as flour and sugar in the large quantities needed. When the second crew arrived from Michigan in May, they brought 60 dozen eggs and mincemeat with them from home. At the peak of the season, the 16 men divided into 2 shifts, 2 a.m. to 11 a.m. and noon to 9 p.m. They switched shifts every week. The poor cooks hardly knew which meal they were cooking. They cooked almost continuously. The first shift breakfast before 2 a.m. While the second shift ate breakfast, the first was served lunch. In the hour between 11 a.m. and noon, both shifts were served the same meal, dinner and lunch, respectively. The second crew ate their final meal at 9 p.m. Sunday was the crew's day to rest, to play, or see the sights of Massachusetts and the Atlantic Ocean. They traveled about in a 1939 Chevrolet. When they weren't sightseeing, they would often try their luck at their own sport, running the logs. Keen eyes and a quick mind were essential in this sport. Only the most nimble of the men were capable of running across the logs in the pond without getting wet. Lloyd could accomplish this feat. When the others tried, the logs always seemed to roll away, and with a splash, the person tumbled into the pond. The struggle was on. It was not the easiest thing in the world to climb back on top of the logs because they always seemed to glide away whenever anyone tried to get astride. The government quota was 10,000 board feet per day. The Michigan City sawmill sawed closer to 15,000 board feet per day. They sawed and stacked 1.5 million board feet of pine for the government, plus some for the local people. The government paid $7 per 1,000 board feet to the mill owners. The men received 35 cents per hour for their labor. Their operation began on April 20th, 1939, and continued for 19 weeks through the end of August 1939. The government then shipped the lumber to England. Individual truck drivers brought the logs to Michigan City. A government person scaled them as they were brought in. Then they were dumped into a pond to prevent beetles from drilling holes through the wood and ruining the logs before they could be sawed up. Pine wood floats, so this alternative was possible. Not all of the government scalers were competent. Walter Wieland was forced to shut down the operation for a couple of days because the first scaler didn't know anything. The government soon sent out a different person. Some of these government people were actually afraid of the Michigan men. They thought that the Michigan men were from the Wild West. Perhaps their appearance led them to that assumption. Sawing outside in the summer was a dusty, gritty, and dirty job. Plus, the crew did not shave every day. In any case, the Michigan men had a good laugh when they found out that they were men from the Wild West. There were no chainsaws until World War II, so the log cutters used crosscut saws. Log skidders dragged the logs to the mill with a 1932 Caterpillar. The Caterpillar was used to drag the logs until Lloyd invented the brainstorm. The brainstorm was a device pulled by the cat. It consisted of a winch on a sturdy metal frame mounted on two steel wheels. Now the logs were raised up and carried. It also featured an automatic tripper so that when the log reached its destination, the driver did not have to stop to release the logs. He simply let the log down and it released itself. The sawyer was the boss. He signaled with his fingers and hands to the setter how to set the blades of the saw for each cut. 1 finger meant 1 inch, 2 fingers 2 inches, 3 fingers 3 inches, and 1/2 finger a 1/2 inch cut. The sawyer had to signal because there was so much noise that he surely couldn't holler above it all. The setter rode the carriage in a standing position and set the blades of the saw for each cut of the log. The rollaway, which was 16 feet long, was the incline which the log had to go up to the carriage. It was hoisted up by a person using a cant hook. The edger removed the bark and wane. The slab sawyer would cut the ends of the board straight. The cat skinner took the edgings and slab wood out into the woods with the cat and brainstormed to dump them. He also delivered the sorted lumber to the stackers. Stackers were the men who stacked the finished product lumber. This was done by hand using a board with a spike on end to jack up each board. The stacks were made 16 feet high. Each stack was a different board size, in other words 2x6, 2x4, 2x8, and so on. Any board 4 feet or longer was bought by the government. Less than 4 feet was slab wood. The stacks had to be made just so, with plenty of air circulation between each board. Slab wood was placed on top of the completed stack so the rain would run off the top and protect the good lumber. In July, the 3060 Rumley kerosene engine blew up. After much consternation, Lloyd proceeded to weld it all back together in a little local shop. Everyone said it couldn't be done because the top casing had blown into over 100 pieces, but he did it. He left the Blau's welder as rent payment for the use of Nell Zonder's local shop. On July 4, Noah Blau, Walter Whelan, and Irvin Blau left for home to begin the year's threshing operations. The sawmill operated with a single crew once again. By the end of August 1939, most of the downed pine trees had been salvaged and sawed into lumber to be shipped to England. All that remained were the mountainous stacks of sawdust 40 feet or higher. The sawdust pile, which towered over Michigan City, like silos do today, was quite the drawing card. The climb to the top was enough to tire anyone. Sometimes, when they reached the top, they'd grab onto each other good-naturedly and fall head over heels as the slow-moving mass of bodies slithered downward. Once at the bottom, a water fight would often ensue. Buckets would quickly appear, and soon everyone would be drenched to the skin. In this way, some of the sawdust would be washed from their clothing. Although the Michigan City sawmill had the untidiest camp, it turned in the most lumber and proved to be the most efficient, 1.5 million board feet.